When the world entered the 1970s, the global economy was thriving. In this prosperous world, the U.S. economy shone brightly, standing above all others. The largest companies of that era were based in the United States, particularly in the automotive industry. Among the automakers, General Motors, GM, reigned supreme, accompanied by other American giants like Ford, Chrysler, and Dodge. These manufacturers produced large cars you've likely seen before, heavy vehicles with gas-guzzling engines. The fuel consumption of these cars was so high that it seemed as though their gas tanks were leaking. But it didn't matter, as gasoline was so cheap that no one cared if their engine was an 8-cylinder or a 4-cylinder. In the early 1970s, U.S. President Richard Nixon introduced regulations aimed at reducing vehicle pollution. These laws infuriated automakers because they reduced the power of 8-cylinder engines significantly, and the same applied to other engines. In response, the three major American car manufacturers, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, decided to retaliate against these regulations by making their engines even bigger. One iconic example from this period is the 1972 Cadillac Eldorado. Instead of complying with Nixon's regulations to reduce emissions, General Motors went the opposite way, equipping the car with an enormous 8-liter, 8-cylinder engine. This engine was massive and fuel-thirsty, but its performance was disappointing. Despite its size and consumption, it produced only 250 horsepower while consuming a staggering 29 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. Still, no one cared. Gasoline was just 9 cents per liter, which was practically nothing for the average American consumer. Let me digress for a moment. Back in the 1950s, President Dwight Eisenhower enacted a law requiring most of the oil consumed in the U.S. to come from domestic sources. However, about 20 years later, during Nixon's presidency, this policy changed. Nixon argued, "Why should we extract oil at great cost when we can import it cheaply from the Persian Gulf?" As a result, Eisenhower's law was repealed, and the U.S. became increasingly dependent on imported oil, particularly from Iran and Arab Gulf states, where oil was abundant and inexpensive. Americans have a saying for situations like this: a recipe for disaster. These policies made the U.S. dangerously reliant on Persian Gulf oil, which was a risky position for a populous country with the highest number of cars in the world and exceptionally high fuel consumption. A forward-looking nation would never allow itself to become so dependent. For now, everything seemed to be going well, almost too well, like the calm before the storm. In October 1973, the flames of war ignited between Arabs and Israel in what the Israelis call the Yom Kippur War. This was the fourth war between Israel and the Arab states. On the surface, it seemed Israel was up against a coalition of 10 countries, but it had strong backers. Europe and the U.S. provided significant support. This Western support enraged the Arab members of OPEC, who decided to impose an oil embargo on Western nations. It was a bold move, especially since the U.S. was entirely dependent on Persian Gulf oil. No one expected the combined Arab armies to falter against Israel, but they did, quickly requesting a ceasefire. Within 2 weeks, the war ended. However, the Arabs, especially Saudi Arabia, felt betrayed by the U.S. and Western countries and decided to continue the oil embargo. In the U.S. and Europe, chaos ensued. America's oil reserves were depleted and gas stations ran dry. If there was any gasoline available, long queues formed, and people even fought over fuel. Europe was somewhat better off because their cars were small and fuel-efficient, often with 4-cylinder engines. While inconvenient, they could manage. American cars, however, guzzled gasoline like crazy. It wasn't even worth starting one to drive to the gas station. Now, how expensive was gasoline? You could say it was $1,000 per liter, not because of the price, but because it was simply unavailable. Even if you were wealthy, you couldn't find black market gasoline. At this point, the U.S. relied heavily on oil imports from the Soviet Union, Iran, Venezuela, Mexico, and Canada. But it wasn't enough. The supply couldn't meet the insatiable demand. As mentioned earlier, the U.S. was a massive consumer of oil. Before the embargo, Saudi Arabia was the largest oil supplier to the United States. So when Saudi Arabia imposed the embargo, it caused a severe shortage. After several months, the Arab nations lifted the embargo, and oil flowed back to the U.S., refilling gas stations and returning daily life to normal. However, Congress and the U.S. government did not return to the status quo. Determined to avoid such a crisis in the future, they took steps to address their consumption issues. The U.S. government's first move was to impose strict regulations on automakers. If they produced fuel-inefficient, polluting cars, they faced heavy fines. This forced car manufacturers to take action, as most of their current production lines would result in fine healings. However, they were given time to adapt. The law provided a 10-year deadline. By 1984, American automakers were prohibited from producing cars that consumed more than 9 liters per 100 kilometers, or 27 miles per gallon. From the very next day, automakers began working to reduce engine sizes, make cars smaller, and decrease emissions, a daunting task that required them to start from scratch. Unlike European and Japanese manufacturers, American automakers had no prior experience in building such cars. They had to proceed through trial and error, a process that was far from easy. The entire production system needed to change. Molds, tools, assembly lines, and even design teams had to be overhauled. This was the only way American manufacturers could produce fuel-efficient cars. Meanwhile, Japanese cars, known for their fuel efficiency, flooded the U.S. market. For the first time, Americans had to buy Japanese cars to avoid exorbitant fuel costs. Those unwilling to wait for American manufacturers to catch up reluctantly purchased Japanese models. In the 1970s, buying a Japanese car in America was akin to buying a Chinese car there today. Not to say Chinese cars are inferior, but they're currently not allowed to be sold in the U.S. An important milestone in this period was the introduction of the 1973 Honda CVCC, which later evolved into the Honda Civic. American consumers increasingly favored Japanese cars, forcing American manufacturers to design vehicles comparable to Japanese models. This marked the beginning of one of the worst eras for American automobiles. American companies started producing small, four-cylinder cars, but they were terrible at it. These vehicles were unreliable, underpowered, and poorly made. For instance, you couldn't use the air conditioning without overheating, unless it was winter. In contrast, Japanese cars worked flawlessly, were affordable, fuel-efficient, reliable, and had fully functional air conditioning. As a result, the stock of American automakers plummeted. Even though the oil crisis eventually ended, American manufacturers continued producing smaller cars. Things stabilized, with oil prices settling at a moderate level, not too cheap, not too expensive. Then came 1979, a year that feels quite familiar to us. This was the year of the Iranian Revolution, which once again disrupted the global oil market. With Iranian oil removed from circulation, prices began to rise. However, this price surge lasted only a few months. By 1980, a competition to produce oil emerged, with countries racing to outproduce one another. This overproduction caused oil prices to plummet, dropping as low as $7 to $8 per barrel. During this period of cheap oil, many oil-producing countries could no longer remain competitive and began exiting the market. Countries like the US, Canada, and notably the Soviet Union, whose economy heavily relied on oil exports, found themselves in trouble. For instance, extracting oil cost $12 per barrel, but they could only sell it for $7, $8, leading to widespread shutdowns. One by one, oil producers were forced out, leaving only a few countries in the game. Who survived? Primarily the nations around the Persian Gulf, including Iran and the southern Gulf states. One other country also managed to stay in the game. Let's continue with the narrative. Venezuela was the other country capable of producing oil profitably at such low prices. No other nation could sustain oil production at these rates. Now, let's talk about the Soviet Union, a superpower whose economy was spiraling toward collapse. With oil prices at rock bottom, the Soviet economy, heavily reliant on oil exports, began to falter significantly. Back in the U.S., what happened to the automotive industry? Despite cheap oil, the U.S. government did not repeal the fuel efficiency and environmental laws. In fact, they doubled down on them. The smog in cities like Los Angeles had become a serious issue, and reducing fuel consumption was seen as a way to address the problem. It was around this time that the U.S. introduced a new regulation. Every car sold in America was required to have a catalytic converter to reduce emissions. Once the U.S. made catalytic converters mandatory, it revolutionized the automotive industry, not only domestically, but globally. The air quality in cities like Los Angeles significantly improved after these laws were enacted. The 1980s, a tough era for U.S. automakers. The 1980s became synonymous with poor quality vehicles from American manufacturers. They were forced to produce small, fuel-efficient cars with catalytic converters to comply with regulations, but they lacked expertise in this area. The results? Experimental, poorly designed cars that were unreliable and short-lived. Even their six-cylinder engines were disappointing, as American manufacturers were only skilled at building large, eight-cylinder engines. The only exception to this decline was their trucks. Pickup trucks were exempt from the strict environmental and fuel efficiency regulations and continued to be produced in their traditional, high-performing manner. American trucks remained excellent and have carried that legacy to the present day. Faced with declining car quality, American manufacturers tried to innovate. Cadillac, for instance, developed an eight-cylinder engine that could deactivate four cylinders in city driving to save fuel. This sounded great on paper, but in practice, it was a disaster. The engine was so unreliable that owners would discard the cars out of frustration. The 1980s thus became the worst decade for the American automotive industry. However, by the late 1980s, U.S. automakers began to adapt, producing smaller, fuel-efficient, and reliable cars that could finally compete with European and Japanese vehicles. Although their efforts were partially successful, they still couldn't surpass their foreign rivals. Today, Toyota is the best-selling automaker in the U.S., followed by Ford and Chevrolet, not General Motors as a whole. Back to oil markets. After the Iranian Revolution, oil prices remained low for an extended period. This persisted until the Soviet Union collapsed due to its economic struggles. Fast forward to 2008, when oil prices skyrocketed during the global financial crisis, reaching an all-time high of over $200 per barrel. Shortly after, prices fell again, and by the COVID-19 pandemic, they dropped to as low as $25 per barrel. Currently, oil prices hover around $70 per barrel. Theories about oil and the fall of the Soviet Union. Some conspiracy theorists suggest this sequence of events was pre-planned. They argue that the oil crisis was deliberately engineered to cripple the Soviet Union, leading to its collapse. While this remains speculation, it's clear that the Soviet Union's dependency on oil revenues played a significant role in its downfall. What do you think? Could this have been part of a larger scheme, or was it just a series of coincidental events? Please support us with subscribe, like, and comments, and thanks for your watching.